In 1700, the Enlightenment is considered to have begun with the start of a project to compile all the world's knowledge into a single encyclopedia. This was in the city of Calais in Alençon. Truly an ironic place for the Enlightenment to begin, due to the decidedly absolute rule of the Archambault royal lineage in that country. Organizing this scholarly effort was a lawyer named Jacques Castille. Having come into means via the death of his landholding father, he quit his practice and utilized his former employees and his acquaintances at the University of Calais to pursue an act of betterment, immortal and significant beyond imagining. To the north, in Iceland proper, the final battle of their bloody and monumental war was underway, the Battle of Skalholt, seat of the Catholic bishop in Iceland. King Ragnar Almarsson, grandson of Sverre, and Tristensen the monk, grandnephew of Gunnar, beleaguered by decades of conflict, faced each other in battle that day. It lasted 5 hours on a quiet and windless plain. Beneath that overcast sky, tens of thousands shed Christian blood. By the end of it, King Ragnar lay dead, and the remnants of his grandfather's Catholic army fled. Tristensen the monk stood victorious and made his most loyal general, Einar Ingolfsson, king of Europe's first Protestant realm. This marked the end of 126 years of war in Iceland. The Protestant victory in the Great Icelandic War came at a series of significant costs, however. Iceland was significantly depopulated, and 3 generations had untold thousands stolen from their ranks. The country was also poor and backwards because it had missed out on 126 years of development on the continent. It was also generally unable to fend off threats like Russia at its frontier, and even after all of that, Protestantism was no longer new or exciting to possible converts. It had missed out on over a century of proselytism. However, though Iceland was mangled beyond recognition, hope for the Protestant faith lived on. Meanwhile, on the 12th of February, Russia was the first country to abolish slavery. Tsar Iziaslav IV Blatomil, seeing that Russia was not a part of the regular colonial game, decided to hand down his command to his people for the purposes of moral grandstanding. Iziaslav saw himself as a man of legendary moral character, almost a saint, and he would not let anyone who thought otherwise of him draw another breath. In this way, the large slave population in Russia was deported to across the nearest border they found themselves. This slave population, made up of native-born Russians convicted of crimes relating to the defaulting of debts, was utterly non-essential, comprising only house servants and domestic errand runners. So despite their numbers, the aristocracy could stand to lose them, unwilling to go to war over what amounted to an inconvenience. The people who filled the regular place of slaves were the serfs, who toiled in the vast fields of Russian earth, and who were not in any way free. Their existence was medieval, generational, and utterly tied to the land. Some of these serfs were bought into domestic roles, and essentially nothing changed. Regardless, Tsar Iziaslav had made his point and would parade around the parties of aristocratic Europe, lording his untarnished morality over their heads. He even ordered those at court to refer to him as Razrushitsulukov. In the meantime, those slaves he expelled into Siberian wastes and foreign marches of other lands were left to fend for themselves, some taken into harsher slavery elsewhere. Those few with the worst luck, by way of expulsion into Lakandu, had found their way into the lower hold of an African slaver ship and into the silver mines of Alençon, Colombia. In May, Kaiser Norbert II died, though as his son died long ago and as he never bothered to adopt, another rose to the throne, breaking the technically unbroken line of the von Bauer house upon the throne of the Volksreich. Rutschin II von Formbach ascended as a strong, intelligent monarch, but any spark of what was once the peasants' kingdom was now gone away even in the throne room of the monarchy. Kaiser Rutschin II was an imperialist of the highest degree, and did everything in his power to wrest the New World from the natives there, even going so far as to conquer entire tribes and expel their inhabitants, matching the other European monarchs in his cruelty. In 1702, he enacted the Blasphemy Act, passing it into common law and making it illegal to share banned books or express contempt for God. In 1703, he invited the Albigensian Church back into the Volksreich, though those that accepted this invitation endured a permanent schism with the original Albigensian Church, which sat at the side of the Kievan Tsar. This church, known as the Nova Volkish Covenant Albigensian Church, or the Nova Church, was subservient to the crown in its entirety. The patriarch they brought with them, Patriarch Linus, was nothing more than a puppet of the Kaiser. Soon after, he enacted the Conventicle Act, banning religious gatherings of 5 or more people which were not approved by the church, though approval intimately required the involvement of the state. In response to these bold power grabs, councils of local leaders in the New World enacted a series of reforms to counter him, which the Kaiser would take some time to respond to. In 1707, Kaiser Rushin II changed the succession laws of the monarchy from an already informally hereditary Tannist election system into an officially primogeniture succession system. In 1708, after a royal marriage with the Volksreich, Russia offered an alliance, but the Volksreich refused, Rushin II too proud to accept collaborators in his ascension to power and glory. Rushin didn't exactly know the Russian hopes, however. Tsar Iziaslav IV, by his wholesale expulsion of the slave population into neighboring countries, had greatly angered them for a variety of reasons. It turned out that a great deal of slaves did indeed survive expulsion, but many had, without other means for survival, become criminals, certain bands of slaves helping each other to sow discord and cause general chaos. In the Magyarország, these slaves, known as Arultek in their country, had retarded Magyarization efforts and banded together with Greeks, bolstering their numbers enough to cause a dedicated mountain-dwelling insurgency. In the disparate realms of the Aksu, they harassed the few trade routes and also edged out their own roving bandits, and so the Aksu called them the Kulgaknar. Finally, those that had crossed into Ming China went east by way of Manchuria and joined the only groups which would accept them into their ranks, the northern pirate flotillas. These pirate bands sailed forth and raided the coastal cities and ports of the Ming Empire, as well as those of Korea, Japan, and even the smaller ports of Southeast Asia. They called these Russian deportees the Moshengren. The wronged countries rounded up as many slaves as they could, roughly 50,000 of the maybe 150,000 which survived the crossing into their borders, demanding the Russian Tsar take them back and make a formal apology. Tsar Iziaslav, a proud man and fearful of these newly hardened criminals, refused their demands. As such, in July, the Magyarország, Aksu, and the Ming Empire launched a full-scale invasion of Russia, which had no allies to speak of. This war, called the 20 Years' War by Russia and the Silk Road Retribution War by the Magyar-Ming Alliance, raged from 1708 to 1728. This was a horrific war, most of Asia awash in blood as a result. Certain great battles, like the Battle of Tashkent in 1710, saw the day won for the Ming, who beheaded all 100,000 men in the city and burned it down, while others, like the Battle of the Yellow Sea in 1716, went to the Russians, which saw the Tsar's ships decimate the Chinese capital fleet and come ashore, laying waste to Shandong, marching inland all the way to Kaifeng, razing Jinan on the way. The final battle was the Battle of Tokaj in 1727, where a combined army of Magyar soldiers and Aksu cavalry gathered in the field to stop a gargantuan Russian army from taking Naxos. The fighting lasted 2 entire days, and it is estimated that the death toll was in the hundreds of thousands. When the remaining Russians emerged victorious and continued their march, Emperor Janos Vankura went to the negotiating table rather than risk his capital. As a result, the Aksu Khan, Mohammad Sarangoril, conceded the war, having nothing to gain but the end of the occupation. The Ming were the last to exit the 20 Years' War in 1728, Emperor Kai accidentally killing himself in his rage by way of bashing his head in against a supporting beam of his palace. The territorial changes made were minor, Ming gaining some border towns and Central Asian cities which hated China, the Magyar gained some land near the Black Sea, and the Aksu were able to return to their usual state of affairs. Russia, meanwhile, was able to take some territory on the Pacific, some Balkan towns, gained Aksu protection on the Silk Road, and exclusive port rights to 3 Chinese cities, Hengchun, Fuzhou, and Ningbo. The total death toll of the 20 Years' War is estimated to be an astounding 3.5 million souls, Russia suffering most losses. Regardless of this steep cost, nearly a generation of young men gone in a misted cloud of blood, this was ostensibly a Russian victory, as the Russian deportees stayed out and Tsar Iziaslav's dignity remained intact. This war proved to the more exploratory and colonial powers that Russia was not to be underestimated. A war of such scale and length would surely have been the undoing of any other European nation. This also had the consequence of spawning major Russian exclaves in Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, which would eventually develop into criminal guilds with different specialties, known as the cliqui. For example, the eastern clique of Asia were known as pirates, while the western clique of the Magyarország were hired assassins, and the central clique of the Middle East was known for its thieves and fraudsters. Meanwhile, colonization continued, and Iceland gained a foothold in North America with their Canadian colony of Vinland, upon which they hung all their hopes for recovery. In 1729, cultural minorities in the Volksreich, like the Poles and Estonians, began to agitate for a representative national parliament, a result of roiling Enlightenment thought, stoked in part by Castile's encyclopedia. Kaiser Rushin II decided to defer them, leading to unrest throughout the mainland where these groups lived. In 1742, Kaiserin Volsana von Formbach ascended to the throne. In October of that year, Russia invaded Korea in an attempt to capitalize on its gains in Asia, a wildly unpopular move. In 1747, due to the new Protestant crown shipping people off to Vinland by force instead of developing and rehabilitating the homeland, revolutionaries gripped Iceland, fighting for a republic. The head of this revolution was, ironically, a Catholic landowner named Ingolf Magnusson. Without the support of the Pope, this revolution resolved itself by the next year, though the Protestant crown was now more aware of what boundaries it was unable to cross. By 1754, Kaiserin Volsana von Formbach annexed several Midwestern Indian tribes in the New World, as well as suspended any official crown policy regarding natives, though many colonials took this as a blank check for further settlement. In 1765, Kaiser Hermann II von Formbach ascended to the throne. Beginning days after his ascension, and at the hands of the dejected and powerless peasantry, basic slaves to the bourgeois class, agitation for greater liberty erupted across the Volksreich. Revolts led by leaderless, oppressed elements sprung up in the mainland and were dashed as soon as possible, but it was devastating to try and contain. In 1768, Aquitania invaded and annexed half of Alençon, and as such the title of Defender of the Catholic Faith passed to Ireland. To the east, Russia's wildly unpopular war with Korea for control of eastern Siberia reached a stalemate. In the New World, Aquitania failed to make any significant gains in a brief war with Africa and Mexico. On the 2nd of September, 1770, Kaiser Hermann II forged an alliance with Russia and Iceland in order to counter the hostile forces of the Magyarország and Aquitania. In March, Ifriqiya was welcomed into the alliance, and the Trinitat Crafta was founded. Royal marriages were unilaterally exchanged soon after. This provided the needed stability and faith in the government to quell the protests and general agitation for liberty. In 1773, Kaiserin Hanna von Formbach ascended to the throne, but promptly died in childbirth, leaving the crown to slip into the hands of a regency council. Due to this, Russia dissolved its alliance with the Volksreich. Despite the general breakup of the short-lived Trinitat Crafta, it set the framework for a dividing line between the alliance structures of the European great powers that would influence diplomacy for centuries to come. In 1777, the Magyarország declared war upon Russia. In 1782, the war ended disastrously for Russia, mostly due to the fact that the Aksu entered the war on the side of the Magyars, while half its men were on the other side of the world engaging Korea in battle. In 1784, the first gold rush struck in Volksreich America, which occupied North America's Midwest. In 1786, Kaiserin Gutta von Formbach was old enough to ascend to the throne. By 1794, the Magyarország decided to press further against their old foe and took over half of Anatolia from Lakandu, devastating the country. Meanwhile, intelligentsia gathering in the innumerable African cafes began to discuss the most dangerous of ideas, republicanism. A landless aristocrat from Montreal named Angelo Randazzo, who was wealthy but estranged from his family, ingratiated himself among the many merchants of Tunis, the capital city, and fed them ideas only the most rabid of reformers would suggest. Namely, Randazzo suggested that Africa, a nation of merchants ruled by aristocrats, should in fact be a nation of merchants run by merchants, guided by the infallible tides of the market. He was convincing enough that on the 15th of March, 1797, revolution broke out in Africa. The revolutionaries agitated for liberty, equality, and fraternity. It quickly gained steam and nearly 50,000 people joined the cause. However, the seemingly sluggish and sleepy aristocracy was in fact neither of those things. Imperatore Croton Musuros summoned the full strength of his armies, and the full swiftness of his slavers, and the full graces of his god, and in 1798 ground the revolution to dust before it could even make it out of Tunis. What seemed like a fat hog sitting on a chest of treasure was in fact a dragon, brooding over its hoard. Regardless of this duly impressive display, the Randazzo Revolution struck at the heart of African stability and disrupted merchant confidence in the system that had served them so well for so long. After he was drawn and quartered, some of Randazzo's close friends and confidants, namely Giovanni Papaladro, fled to the New World, Alençon Holdings in particular. This timing was fortuitous for them, as in 1803, Alençon, to recoup the losses it suffered at the hands of Aquitania, enacted a series of crushing tax mandates in its colonial holdings. As such, Papaladro was able to mimic his deceased revolutionary confidant and sow the seeds of discontent. And so, Colombia declared war upon their colonial masters in the Papaladros Independence War. On the 4th of October, 1811, having utilized its advantageous knowledge of the jungles and other wilds in the area, Colombia won its independence from Alençon under President Giovanni Papaladros, who promptly issued the construction of a statue in honor of Angelo Randazzo, whom he called the father of revolutions. This was an ill-placed gesture, however. Papaladros, in fact, had many disagreements with Randazzo, given that Randazzo was interested in the merchant part of Merchant Republic more than anything else. In fact, a despotism of the money changers would be enough for him. He simply co-opted Republican language as it was the most striking revolutionary framework of his time. Regardless, Papaladros didn't want to build a statue of himself, as he believed it would lend credence to the accusations of his monarchical detractors that he was merely a power-hungry politician. So, Papaladros, a true believer in the Republican ideal and the just heart of the common man, had to sanitize the memory of his friend and ascribe to him post-mortem beliefs that he did not hold in life in order to keep his own dream alive. Meanwhile, many of the high-minded revolutionaries in Africa ended up running off to join the new independent Colombia, which was heralded as the first republic of a new age. An unintended consequence of this was that Africa was now cemented in its absolutism, and the issue of anybody ever challenging that system from within was, for all intents and purposes, solved indefinitely.